Alright, hello, welcome to class. Today is just a review for the Chapter 5 test on methods. And here we have a sample AP question that has a method called scramble. And it takes in two parameters, a string called word, and then an int representing, just called how far. And it's asking to say what is returned if it's called with compiler and 3. So word is going to be compiler, and how far is going to be 3. So it returns some substrings here. So just see if you can break down these substrings. These are the two parameter substrings, and then see what is returned. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to try it. The first substring is from how far plus 1, so that's from 4 up to word.length, which would be for compiler. I think we should probably write it out with all the indexes. Okay, so compiler goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So length would be 8. So it's going to go from 4 to 8. So from 4 all the way to the end. And remember, a substring runs one pass, so it's okay to go to 8 here. And so that's going to return Euler. Okay, so it's going to do Euler plus substring from 0 to how far. So this would be a substring from 0 to 3. How far is 3? So that's going to be 0 to 3 right here. Remember, it runs one pass, so it won't take the p. It'll take the com. So this thing is going to return com. Okay, so it does it in order. So the Euler is first, so it's going to be Euler plus com. So it's going to be Euler com is what is returned here, which would be a letter C. Okay, so I'm just going to throw a bunch of review questions at you. I'm going to have you try them first, pause the video, and then unpause to see the solution. All right, so what is displayed by this call to divide by 2? Go ahead, pause the video. Okay, so this has a lot to do with variable scope and how methods work, where this is a void method, so nothing is going to be returned to the calling method, in this case main. And it just basically takes this number and divides it by 2. But please note that it doesn't actually divide this x variable by 2, it just takes 50. So when you call this with x, you're actually passing just the value of x, which is 50. So it takes that value and divides it by 2 and stores it in input, right? But this variable is different than x. Okay, if nothing's returned to main, you're not going to modify x. So all that's going to happen here is this still is going to be 50 because the value gets passed in here and then gets printed, right? And what gets changed is a different variable called input, which has scope just down in this method. So the value of x gets passed in, not the actual variable, and so it still prints out 50 in that case. If you wanted x to change, we would have to do x equals this and then change this return type to int. And then return input here. That would actually return the value of input and then store it in the x variable up in main. All right, what is displayed by this code? All right, so this one is actually going to return 25. So what's different compared to the previous one is x has scope all the way inside of here. So because it's declared at this level of parentheses, it has scope at that level and any sub parentheses. All right, so it starts off being existing here, and then it gets set to 50, right? And then it goes down, and the divide by 2 method has access to this x, so it's not being passed in or anything. It just exists all inside of these methods. So now it'll actually change the value of x to 25, right? Divide by 2 and store it in x. So now it'll be 25, and so that's what will get printed out here because the method is called before the print statement. Okay, and this actually to me is a pretty good example of why you don't generally do this. Is called a global variable where it's accessible to all the methods. And the reason is just kind of confusing. Like, like for example, I mean, this code's pretty simple, but as it got more complex, you might look at this method by itself and say, what the heck is X? Where does it exist? Right? That we don't have any clue about what is X in this case, right? So it's confusing code, right? And in a similar way, you might expect X to be 50 here unless you dug down and figured out what happened in this method. And again, that's not so bad in simple code like this, but as your code gets really complex, it's hard to keep track of the variables if they're global like this. It's easier if they're passed in and out of the methods. It's like input and output parameters. So it's kind of unconventional to do it this way, but in certain situations, you might have a global variable. I think of scanner maybe to be one, or a constant like an int that doesn't change, like a constant value. Oftentimes that'll be a global variable. Anyways, moving on. Correct way to call, we have a method here called count repeat letters. So if I was in main or something, we have to imagine we're in main, how would you call this method? Okay, so pause the video, give it a shot. So you're going to call it with its name. So we're just going to type count repeat letters. Okay, and then we're going to pass in a string. So I'll just use balloon here or whatever. So we're going to pass in that string and then it returns an int. So I'd want to store that. So in here, I would want to do like int repeat count or something, and then call it like that. Okay, so that's what it looked like in main, is you pass in a string and it would return an int, and you'd want to store it in a variable named whatever you want to name it. Okay, one more like that. How would you call this code from main? Pause the video and give it a shot. Right, so this one is void, so there's no return type, right? So I'm just going to call repeat and then pass in a string like that. All right, so it takes in an input, a single input of string, and then it returns nothing. So in main, you don't have any value being stored. You just call the method and pass in a string. This method likely, if it's void, just prints some stuff. Maybe it prints this string a couple times or something like that. But yeah, no need to return anything back in main. Okay, so now we're kind of going reverse. So we were taking the heading and writing what was called in main. Now we're going to take the call from main and figure out what is the heading. Okay, so if this is a call to calculate volume, right, what would it look like for the heading for calculate volume, right? What would this heading, when I mean heading, this is what I mean by heading right there. So write out what would the heading be for this calculate volume method. Okay, so it would be public static, not void. It looks like it's storing a double value. So when it's being called, it is storing it in a double. So that means our return type must be a double. Okay, and then we call the method by its name, or sorry, the heading would have to have the name, calculate volume. Mr. Westpatal can spell this right. And then it takes in, it looks like 3 ints or doubles. I guess it's hard to tell from here, but without the 0.0, I'm going to call them ints. So int A, int B, int C, or whatever you want to call them. You can give them whatever name you want. And then you just have an opening curly brace. I guess that's not technically part of the heading, but generally that's what would come next. So here's your heading, right? And that would be 3 ints coming in. And remember, when they talk about like the signature of the method, the signature is this part, the name along with the input parameters. And remember, those have to be unique. Not the name necessarily, but the name combined with the number and type of inputs has to be unique when you write your methods. All right, one more quick one like that, a slightly different one. Pause the video. What would the heading look like? Okay, so I'm going to go public static. It returns a string, right? It's storing it in string, so our method needs to return a string. and I'm going to call it merge strings, and I'm going to pass in, right, these look like two strings because they're in double quotes. So I'm going to do string, string 1, or whatever, comma, and then string, takes in two strings to this particular method. All right, so that's what the heading would have to look like. If it's called like this in main, it would have to return a string and take in two string input parameters. All right, next is spotting some errors. So pause the video here and see if you can find the error. Give it some thought. All right, so your answer here is the return type of void means you don't have a return statement. So they don't match, right? This return is returning a string, but the method type or the method heading says it's void. So you'd either have to get rid of this return statement here, knock that out, or change this void to be a string so that they match, right? So you could fix it either way, either make this string or take out the return type. All right. Next error one, see if you can spot the error in this method. Okay, and so our error here is we're doing a random number with a max amount allowed is you don't want a semicolon here, right? This method is like a control structure, so it has an open and closed parenthesis, and so no semicolon there. That's our problem, right? So that is our error on this one. All right, one more error one, see if you can spot it. You could also think about how you might fix the error. This is a tricky one. All right, so our problem here is the return type is string, and we are returning friend, which is a string that they enter here. So we're returning a friend string, that's okay. But the problem is this if could evaluate to false, right? Every if condition is like a true or false statement. So if it evaluated to false, then it wouldn't return anything. All right, so basically Java doesn't like that. You have to guarantee that something is returned. And so if there's a potential for something not to be returned, it's going to complain. Okay, so the way to fix this would be to add an else clause to the end of this so that it will either run the if or the else. Or sometimes what I do is I just put a return at the end, right? And just some sort of default thing. Sometimes I put error, or in this case, you might put no friends or something like this. So anyways, you can put a default return at the end so that it's guaranteed that something will always return. Right, so that's a kind of a tricky error, but if you have a return type here, you have to make something returned. In this case, a string has to be returned. Okay, so overloading a method. See if you can remember what that term means. All right, and so pause the video and see if you can write like another method heading that would show a correct overload of the compute method. Okay, so what overload means is you have the same name, right, but a different set of input parameters. Okay, so one way to overload this method would be, there'd be a million ways actually, not a million, but whatever, a lot. So the return type doesn't matter, so I can still have double and I can do compute, but then to be overload, it's going to be named compute, but you can't have the same input parameters. So if I just do double value, so it's a single input into the method, that would be enough to have an overloaded method because it would be the same name but different input. Okay, and so the idea of an overload is if I'm in main, right, then when I call the method, it knows which one to use, even though it's got the same name, because if I do compute 4.6 or something, 4.0 and 6.0, then it'll know to run the first compute up here because that's the one that has two input parameters. So it's enough information to differentiate between the two compute, even though they're the same name. But because you have two input parameters here and the other one has only one, that allows us to know which one is called. All right, so that's called overload method, and this would be an example of overload. Thanks for watching.